So now I'll talk a little bit about the content standards. What do you put in metadata? So back in 1995, there was a group of people involved in library and computer science circles that convened in Dublin, Ohio, and they came up with this thing called Dublin Core, which is not for geospatial metadata. It's basically for writing metadata about anything that could be, I would say these days, on the web. And it only had, the core refers to the idea that there are some things that you could document about almost anything. And there are 15 things that they came up with, and these are the 15 things. So none of this is unique to geospatial metadata, but you could take these things and describe a geospatial data set. And so, as it turns out, Dublin Core has been around for a long, long time, and is a very sort of easy-to-use list of fundamental things that most people might want to document if they were throwing a data set out there into the wilds of the internet and wanted people to know what it was. I won't go into it in too much more detail than this. And then a little bit later in the 90s, the Federal Geographic Data Committee, which is a multi-agency federal committee, came up with the content standard for digital geospatial metadata. It's very specific. Says it's a content standard right in the title, but most people don't say CSDGM. Most people somehow just call this the FGDC metadata. And what they did was they sort of they said, well, you know, geospatial data is a little more specialized than videos and images that you might throw out there on the web. There's a lot more things that people might want to know about it. And so they tried to bundle a whole lot of things into one content standard. They said, you know, in addition to telling me the title or who the creator was and when you created it, you should also probably help a prospective user know where they can get it, how hard it is to get, if the information in it is appropriate for another geospatial use. So there's a lot of information in there about documentation. And then in the early days yet, they included a few places where you could put in a URL for where you could get the data, but they didn't really know how people would be sharing geospatial data. So it's not very specific. FGDC content records, or metadata records, have these 7 sections in them. One of the things that the FGDC did was they introduced this idea of, in Dublin Core, everything is optional. In FGDC, some things are mandatory. These things that are yellow are mandatory. And then everything else is either optional or mandatory if it's applicable to your data set. So if you decide that there's something about your data set that you need to document that has to do with data quality, and you start working on the data quality section, then a whole bunch of things become required because you decided you need to do something about data quality. And so the whole standard for FGDC works this way. If you need to start one of these many sections, then you probably are supposed to finish it. And that became one of the burdens of FGDC, was that, well, everybody has a little bit to say about some of these things, and the whole content standard becomes triggered, and people ended up starting to create really large and long and onerous metadata records. And depending on the kind of system that you use to help to write it, it can be a real drag. So a few years later, and I think I may not quite have the date on this right, I think it might be 2 years earlier, metadata kind of went international, geospatial metadata kind of went international, made its way up to the International Standards Organization. And they came up with a content standard that, you know, had learned the lessons that had come from, say, the FGDC process, where everything becomes mandatory if you start writing in a section. And what they did was they said, no. Metadata can be modular, and you can build a metadata record for whatever's relevant to your organization based on pulling together the modules that you need to document for your organization. So, unfortunately with ISO, they do everything with numbers. And so it's very hard to talk about this stuff without sounding like a robot. But they created an umbrella standard called 139. And inside of it are modules that have other numbers. And depending on your organization, you may pick one of these numbers or a suite of these numbers to come up with metadata records that work for your organization. So I'll just point out that at the core, if all you had was web services and all you wanted to write documentation for was web services, and all you might want to do is fill in these records that are called 119 records. That would do it for your organization. Then outside of that circle, if you want to go a little further and write some of the stuff that might be in a regular FGDC metadata record, there's a circle called 115. 115 will really get you through all the things that might be necessary to document, I would say, vector data, vector geospatial data. And then, what if you've come from an organization where you create a lot of gridded data or imagery data, raster data, all the extra things that might be necessary to document a raster data set are in the outer circle, or a slightly more outer circle of 115-2. And on and on and on. Basically, it's an additive process. You could start really small down here and just produce this kind of a record if all you're doing is services. If you feel it's really important to document feature classes, there's this whole circle just for feature classes to explain how the entities and attributes in your data relate. And I don't think I decoded all of them down here in the footer for people who care. But the point of ISO is that they wanted to take the burden off of people that had come with kind of the idea of an FGDC CSDGM kind of a system. It's kind of like a build your own metadata kind of a system. It's modular and flexible. It helps people depict the relationship between data sets. So for example, you could create a collection level data set, which could have child data sets that are the members of the collection. It helped simplify some things by standardizing descriptors using code lists. So you can pick things from code lists rather than in FGDC there was a lot of free text typing that happened. And then they also have it on kind of a tight revision schedule where every 5 years they look at it and they try to improve it based on what they're hearing from the community. So that's ISO. So in terms of getting up to speed on metadata, this presentation is really kind of just a highlight reel from other people's presentations. FGDC, if you're from an organization that's using their CSDGM standard, has a great metadata quick guide that you can download that will easily, in theory, and easily explain all the sections of their standard. There's an older document from former NOAA Coastal Services Center that was that had a mascot called Metadata Bob. He's still out there on the internet, although I noticed he's kind of hard to find these days.
It's like more than 10 years old.
And then NOAA has been doing a lot of great training. Basically, is it quarterly? It's very often. It repeats very often. Where they do intro to CSDGM, they do intro to ISO, and then they also do a third training that's transitioning from one to the other. So you may be from an organization that does CSDGM and you want to go to ISO. So these are links to Jackie's trainings, training materials. So it's got all her PowerPoint presentations, all of her exercises, and even recordings of her sessions. And then for people who are getting into ISO, ISO is a really big, ISO is a standards organization that you have to be a member of to get their documents. It's actually difficult to read their documents. So what NOAA did was, I guess, they joined and then they created workbooks so that people don't have to actually get documents directly from ISO. So if you go to these links, you can get the NOAA workbooks on the ISO standard. That MD is for essentially for the vector data, and MI is for the raster data. And what these workbooks do is they go through the standard and they say what's appropriate for each section of the standard, so what kind of content you put in each section. They also diagram it out so you sort of can see what goes in each section. They provide FAQs and implementation. These are very helpful if you start to go down the path of wandering into ISO metadata.